Good afternoon, and welcome to this special presentation of OGE's Institute for Ethics and Government. My name is Patrick Shepard. Today we are very fortunate to be joined by Monica Ashar from OGE's General Counsel and Legal Policy Division. Today we'll be discussing part one of our two-part series on 5 CFR 2638, the updates to which were published just last week, yeah?
Just last week.
So it's just been a few days, and we wanted to take this opportunity to share with you sort of an overview of some of those changes and make sure the community is comfortable with them. So shall I pull up your slides, Monica, and we'll just get started? Excellent.
Okay, so today I'm going to be providing an overview of the revisions of 5 CFR Part 2638, as Patrick mentioned, which is the Executive Branch Ethics Program. The final rule amending this regulation was published very recently on November 2nd, and the changes go into effect on January 1st, 2017. As Patrick also mentioned, today's presentation is part one of a two-part broadcast. So today what I'm going to do is walk you through most of the subparts of Part 2638 and provide you with some of the highlights. The exception to this is going to be Subpart C, which deals with government ethics education. That's going to be the subject of tomorrow's presentation, which also begins at 2 p.m. So I hope you will join us again tomorrow. The revision of Part 2638 is part of a larger set of regulatory revisions that OGE has been undertaking over the past couple of years. So, for example, the revisions to 2635 Subpart F became effective in August, and the proposed revisions to Part 2634 were published last month as a proposed rule. So this is one of several revisions that's in the works. And with Part 2638, OGE began drafting a comprehensive revision in early 2015. And by way of background, much of Part 2638 was issued in 1981, when the Executive Branch Ethics Program was still quite new, and the remaining provisions were added in the early 1990s. So with the exception of the provisions that deal with training, Part 2638 has really changed very little in the past 35 years. So in order to better reflect the present-day Executive Branch Ethics Program, as well as to introduce certain programmatic improvements, we decided to draft an almost total revision. And in drafting this revision, I want to note that we involved the ethics community from the very beginning. So if you imagine this process on a game board, this is my map that I often use when I'm talking about the revisions. You'll see that very early on, once we had produced an initial draft, we sought consultation from you, the agencies. This happened through meetings, through phone calls, and from written feedback from you on various drafts of the proposed rule. And this happened well before we even began the formal rulemaking process. In total, we had about 50 agencies provide input during various stages of the process, both the formal process and the informal process. And on behalf of OGE, I want to thank all of the agencies that provided us with their insights. We received many comments from you, and the feedback that we received has truly strengthened the end product. So this chart gives you an overview of the structure of the revised 2638. But before I get into the details, I want to note that throughout this presentation, I'm going to be comparing the current version of 2638 to the revised or the new version, with the new version going into effect on January 1st of 2017. So although we're broadcasting today's presentation live, I want to point out that if you're watching a recording of the presentation and you're looking at it after January 1st, the revised version of the regulation is going to be the one that's in effect. So taking a look at our chart, if you're familiar with the current 2638, you'll notice that many of the provisions have moved around somewhat. For example, you'll notice that the general provisions have moved from the beginning of the regulation, Subpart A, to the end of the regulation at Subpart F. And I'm going to begin by talking about the revised Subpart A. So we'll begin where the regulation begins. This contains the mission of the Executive Branch Ethics Program, as well as the responsibilities of a variety of groups that play a special role in the ethics program. OGE wanted to open with a big picture view of the executive branch ethics program, starting with the mission, which is to prevent conflicts of interest on the part of executive branch employees. We then go on to explain the breadth of the mission and what is meant by a conflicts-based program. While the mission itself is not new, it's now memorialized in the regulation that governs the executive branch ethics program. One of the reasons for including it here is that the term ethics often means different things to different people, and there's often confusion among outside groups as to what the executive branch ethics program's mission actually is. So here we clearly define it and we explain its scope in the regulation. The revised Subpart A also describes the responsibilities of the many officials that play a role in the government ethics program. The current 2638 sets forth the responsibilities of the agency head, the DAO and deputy ethics officials, and the Office of Government Ethics. With the revised 2638, we take a comprehensive look at who has responsibilities and what those responsibilities are, starting with employees and supervisors. Further, we recognize that there are agency operations that are outside of the DAO's control, but that nonetheless affect the ethics program. And so we articulate the responsibilities of lead human resources officials, which I'm going to discuss shortly. And we also highlight the role of inspectors general. They play a part in the ethics program by investigating ethics violations, as well as notifying OGE of criminal referrals to the Department of Justice. And then finally, as with the current 2638, we set forth the responsibilities of agency ethics officials, the agency head, and the Office of Government Ethics. Just a couple of things I want to note here. In the section on agency ethics officials, we've included a list of ethics responsibilities that may be performed only by the DAO or a DAO. For example, one of these is requesting the approval of an agency supplemental ethics regulation. It's important to note that this list does not change existing requirements. Rather, it collects them in a central location. Next, in the section on agency heads, we've tried to emphasize that the agency head is ultimately responsible for ensuring that the agency's ethics program is highly effective. For example, the revised regulation states that agency heads are responsible for, among other things, establishing and maintaining an effective agency ethics program, as well as fostering an ethical culture in the agency. Toward these ends, the agency head is required to provide the DAO with sufficient resources, including staffing, to sustain an effective ethics program. Further, the agency head must require agency officials to provide the DAO with the information, the support, and the cooperation necessary for the accomplishment of the DAO's responsibilities. So next, I want to talk about a few new things that you'll find in Subpart A. As I mentioned earlier, another new section that you'll find in Subpart A pertains to what we call the lead human resources official. OGE defines the lead human resources official as the agency's chief policy advisor on all human resources management issues, who is charged with selecting, developing, training, and managing a high-quality, productive workforce. In many cases, the lead human resources official will be the agency's chief human capital officer. These requirements for the lead human resources official were established in order to strengthen the coordination between human resources and agency ethics officials in support of the agency's ethics functions. Oh, I apologize. I believe I got ahead of myself. And so, continuing on. With regard to the lead human resources official, with respect to financial disclosure, the lead human resources official is required to notify the DAO of all appointments to public or confidential filing positions prior to appointment whenever practicable, but no later than 15 days after appointment. They're also required to notify the DAO of all terminations from public filing positions prior to termination whenever practicable, but no later than 15 days after termination. Again, these financial disclosure reports are required to be filed within 30 days. Requiring the lead human resources official to notify the DAO ultimately helps the filer meet the 30-day filing deadline. We also recognize that the Human Resources Office may carry out certain other ethics-related responsibilities. For example, under the revised 2638, agencies are required to send out notices to prospective employees in their offer letters. And I'm going to discuss the substance of this requirement in more detail tomorrow. But because the requirement pertains to offer letters, which are generally sent out by HR, it might make sense for the agency to have the HR office send out the required ethics notices to new hires as well. If the HR office is assigned by the agency to do this or certain other tasks, HR is also required to coordinate with the DAO, follow the DAO's directions, and comply with any requirements. Regarding tracking, if HR is assigned additional duties, HR must provide a written summary of its procedures and confirmation that the procedures have been implemented. Again, using the example of notices to new hires, if the HR office is assigned by the agency to do this, the agency does not need to track every single notice that is sent out. Again, we're looking for a written summary of the procedures and confirmation that they have been followed. Now I'm going to skip back a couple of slides, and I do apologize. I want to highlight some of the practices that OGE has institutionalized for itself. These are things that we've done in recent years that engage with the ethics community. Engagement with the ethics community and soliciting input from agency ethics officials have been and continue to be priorities for OGE's director. And we've seen that this increased engagement has directly benefited the executive branch ethics program. So the revised 2638 institutionalizes these practices to ensure that future directors continue them. Some of these practices include convening quarterly meetings with key agency ethics officials, maintaining an ethics agreement guide that provides sample language for PAS ethics agreements, issuing year-end reports to agencies regarding their compliance and timely transmitting the annual 278s of certain high-level officials to OGE, as well as promptly submitting any additional information needed in order for OGE's director to certify the reports. These are letters that OGE has been sending to agency heads, and in the couple of years that we've been sending them, they've generally been very glowing accounts of the hard work that the agency's ethics programs accomplish with respect to financial disclosure. And then finally, where practicable, consulting agency ethics officials when developing guidance, such as legal advisories, as well as substantive revisions to OGE's regulations. The next new requirement that I want to highlight is the requirement that new DAOs at large agencies must be at the senior executive level or higher. This requirement applies when an agency has at least 1,000 employees. The DAO is appointed after January 1st of 2017. That is when the regulation goes into effect. And then when the agency has at least 10 positions at the senior executive level or higher. OGE explains what we mean by senior executive in the definition section of the revised regulation. And so a senior executive is a career or non-career appointee in the senior executive service or equivalent federal executive service. It also includes employees in senior level and senior technical positions, and it includes equivalent positions in agencies that do not have a federal executive service. I also want to note that this new requirement does not apply to current DAOs, only those that, again, are appointed after January 1st of 2017. So next, moving on to Subpart B. The revised Subpart B centralizes the procedures of the executive branch ethics program. Currently, these procedures are found in the existing Part 2638, as well as in advisories on OGE's website. So, for example, some of the procedures are currently found in Subpart F of the current 2638. These include the general provisions on furnishing records and information, the notice to OGE's director on referrals to the Department of Justice, and the annual report on the agency's ethics program. I'd also like to note that OGE issued a program advisory last week on updated procedures for notifying OGE of conflict of interest referrals to the Department of Justice. The program advisory also contains the revised OGE Form 202. So if you haven't had a chance to read the advisory yet, I'd encourage you to take a look at it. Next, sections 203 through 205 of the revised 2638 establish the procedures that the Executive Branch Ethics Program will use to collect public and confidential financial disclosure reports. At present, these procedures are set forth in Program Advisory 15-01. And you may be thinking, isn't financial disclosure covered in Part 2634? So what Part 2634 does is that it addresses the substantive requirements of public and confidential financial disclosure, as well as the processes for individual agencies' review and maintenance of financial disclosure reports. Part 2638, on the other hand, sets forth the procedures for collection. Next, Section 208 pertains to the written guidance that OGE issues. If you recall, in 2010, OGE issued a deogram that bid farewell to OGE deograms. And so with the revised regulation, OGE establishes 3 types of written guidance that we will issue. These are legal advisories, which are memoranda on the interpretation of government ethics laws and regulations. There are also program advisories, which are intended primarily to instruct agencies on uniform procedures for the Executive Branch Ethics Program. And finally, they consist of informal advisory opinions, which are intended primarily to provide guidance to individuals and illustrate the application of government ethics laws and regulations to specific circumstances. Next, Section 209 pertains to formal advisory opinions, which are currently addressed in Subpart C of the existing Part 2638. These are issued on matters of general applicability or important matters of first impression, and they allow for interested parties to submit written comments when practicable. I want to point out that OGE has issued 2 of these in its history, the last of which was in 1983. And when a particular subject does not meet the criteria for a formal advisory opinion, OGE's director may choose instead to issue an informal advisory opinion. Informal advisory opinions, again, are one of the 3 types of written guidance that are set forth in Section 208. Subpart B also introduces a new requirement, and this requirement pertains to presidential transition planning. Agencies must begin their preparations for a presidential transition at least a year before any presidential election. These preparations are going to vary by agency and are generally going to depend on the number of political positions that are expected to turn over. As OGE has said, these preparations do not constitute support for a particular candidate and are not reflective of a belief regarding the likely outcome of the election. Rather, they reflect an understanding that agencies are responsible for ensuring the continuity of governmental operations. In particular, the concern was that when a first-term president is running for re-election, agency officials may be reluctant to prepare for a transition. And we wanted to signal in the regulation that transition preparation is a responsibility, and therefore to provide agency officials with some cover that will free them to prepare for a possible transition. So at this point, I'm going to bring up the overview slide again. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be speaking about the changes in Subpart C tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern. Subpart C is where you're going to find some of the more significant changes which were made to strengthen the effectiveness of ethics training across the executive branch. Tomorrow, I'll be discussing the provisions that are completely new to the regulation, as well as the provisions that improve upon requirements in the current Part 2638. I also want to note that OGE will soon be issuing an advisory with a handy one-page chart that provides an overview of these new training requirements. So stay tuned for that. Subpart D contains the provisions on the correction of executive branch ethics programs. These provisions come into play when there are indications that an agency ethics program is not in compliance with applicable requirements. The current Subpart D establishes the formal actions that the director of OGE may take to bring an ethics program into compliance. What I want to highlight here is that the revised 2638 introduces several informal actions that the director may take before resorting to formal action. So one example of an informal action, for example, would be contacting the DAO to identify and discuss a relevant issue. These informal procedures that you'll find in the revised 2638 reflect the practice of OGE over the past several decades. We have found that informal resolution is often an appropriate and effective alternative to formal action. OGE's experience has been that informal resolution is both time effective and cost effective. And in addition, it produces better results because ethics officials and other stakeholders at the affected agency are actively involved in crafting and implementing the resolution. Of course, in the event that informal action does not resolve the matter, the director may still take formal action. Subpart E contains the procedures for addressing potential violations of non-criminal ethics laws and regulations by individual employees. These corrective action procedures were established in 1990 and since then have generated considerable confusion among external stakeholders. So the revised Subpart E tries to clarify three fundamental elements. First, it clarifies the meaning and effect of Subpart E, particularly with respect to the limits on OGE's authority to direct employees. Second, it emphasizes that in practice, suspected violations are generally resolved without the need for formal action on OGE's part. And then third, it makes clear that as a matter of law, the formal procedures may be used only when no criminal law is implicated. So I'm going to conclude by saying a few words about Subpart F. The current 2638 begins with the general provisions. In the revised 2638, we've moved these to the end. And so in the current Subpart F, you're going to find the authority and purpose. These have remained unchanged from the current Part 2638. You'll also find the provision on agency supplemental regulations, as well as the definitions section. So one definition that I'd just like to quickly highlight is the definition of special government employee. We found that there's often confusion as to what a special government employee is, as well as OGE's role with respect to special government employees. This definition here in Subpart F provides a comprehensive explanation of what an SGE is and notes that the appointment of SGEs is not administered or overseen by OGE. Rather, it's carried out under legal authorities administered by other agencies, such as the Office of Personnel Management. Finally, I'd like to note that we've added a comprehensive list of dates and deadlines that pertain to agency ethics programs. This list reflects the dates and deadlines that are otherwise dispersed throughout this part, as well as other statutes and regulations. And they've been collected here as a convenient reference. I'd also like to note that OGE is continuing to issue its annual schedule of important dates, which, as you know, ties the required dates and deadlines to the current calendar year. And in fact, OGE plans to issue the 2017 schedule of important dates before the end of the month. So this concludes my presentation. And just to reiterate, the changes that I've discussed here today will go into effect on January 1st, 2017. As I mentioned earlier, tomorrow I'll be discussing Subpart C, Government Ethics Education. That presentation will also take place at 2 p.m., and I hope you will join us then.
So thank you very much, Monica, for joining us today to share your insights and guidance around the amendments to 2638. Thematically, it seems like we're memorializing some lessons learned in the last 30 years. We're emphasizing cooperation amongst and between agencies, and really prioritizing the interactions that OGE has with the ethics community and the importance of continuing that kind of communication. So I think we're all very excited to hear about the changes to the training requirements tomorrow. So thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you tomorrow at 2 p.m. To discuss the updates to the training requirements. Thanks again, Monica.
Thank you.